well. Again, one of the most famous of whom is Gilbert Ryle, who in a book published in 1949, The Concept of Mind, basically says that it's just a mistake to think about minds. What we really should be doing is thinking about behaviors, okay? It's a mistake to think of minds as separate from bodies. It's a mistake to think of minds as a separate component of bodies. Let's just think about bodies. And we're going to redefine mental states as behaviors or as dispositions to behaviors. So hunger is the kind of thing you have 4 hours after you last ate. Okay, that's what hunger is. And thirst is the kind of thing you have after you've talked for 50 minutes. There are various kinds of circumstances, definable circumstances where we use mental terms, but what we really should be talking about are these circumstances, not the mental terms itself. Ryle, for example, agreeing with Watson that the best way to think about thinking was as talking to oneself. Okay, so we get these kinds of translations. Thinking is talking to oneself. Believing something isn't a mental state. When we say somebody believes something, what we really mean is they are behaving as if something were true. So all mental terms are translated into behavioral descriptions, descriptions that include both behavior and the circumstances under which that behavior takes place. This philosophical behaviorism kind of arose, Ryle, I'm not even sure, actually references Watson. So it arose essentially independently of Watson, but was really an attempt to deal with this Cartesian legacy that we talked about before. And again, it has had quite a bit of appeal in psychology. There are a group of investigators who really want to either deny consciousness to begin with, or deny that consciousness has any kind of significance. There are books around by both philosophers and psychologists with variants in their titles as The Illusion of Consciousness, or The Illusion of Consciousness, the Conscious Will, which basically argue that consciousness doesn't really exist. Why doesn't it exist? Because you can't see it, you can't touch it, you can't feel it, you can't taste it. It's not part of the material, not part of the material world. And there's this whole tradition in philosophy associated with philosophers in Vienna, so-called Vienna Circle, which basically said nothing exists that can't be publicly verified. And since we can't publicly verify anybody's state of mind, all we can see is their behavior. Therefore, consciousness doesn't exist. And whatever it is that's going through our minds, it's irrelevant to our function. Okay? This is, again, epiphenomenalism. It's not just something that comes out of the 19th century. It's something that kind of sticks. The best way to think about the mind is as some kind of computer, some kind of virtual machine, not a machine made out of moving parts necessarily, that simply takes stimulus inputs, processes them in various ways, and then delivers various kinds of response outputs. Okay, so what we are then is just kind of back at Descartes' impasse. Okay, if we're going to take consciousness seriously, we seem to be stuck in James's position, where science forces us to adopt something like a materialist stance, that there are brains and consciousness is somehow a product of a brain activity. But our everyday experience of choosing, feeling, wanting, believing, knowing, inclines us towards dualism, towards this idea that minds are somehow different from bodies. And so what you've got is a bunch of different kinds of responses in the philosophical scene. There are people like Ryle and Watson, perhaps, who just want to give up on folk psychology, just rule consciousness out of the discussion and talk about behavior and the circumstances under which it occurs. Or you can do some kind of non-reductionist materialism where people say, all right, mind is a product of brain. I understand this. That's right. But still, mind is something different. Okay? So you've got whatever mind is, it can't be reduced to various physical activities. Then you got people who try to blend materialism and dualism in various kinds of ways. You get people who just say, I'm a dualist and I don't care. And then you've got a bunch of people who give up on the whole thing entirely. This is what is known in philosophy as the explanatory gap, a concept that we owe to a philosopher named Levine, who basically says that you can have a physicalist theory of consciousness if you want. You can say that brains produce minds, or minds are the product of brains somehow. But the one thing you can't do with this physical theory is explain how it is that physical interactions between material substances like neurotransmitters flowing through, flowing between neurons and all that, how all of that gives rise to conscious experience. Okay? As materialists, as scientists, we assume that the brain does it somehow, but exactly how brain processes give rise to conscious experience, that's what Levine calls the explanatory gap. And in various writings, Levine has used arguments kind of like the following. Suppose I said to you that the motion of molecules creates heat. Well, if you've taken physics, at least if you did better in your physics class than I did in mine, you know exactly how that works, okay? You know how it is that the motion of molecules is going to create a rise in temperature. And pretty much for a couple of hundred years, we've had that worked out. Now, suppose I offer you a sentence that seems to have exactly the same structure to it. That light waves of 700 nanometers falling on the retina of the eye creates the experience of red. That's not at all the same kind of explanation, right? Because while it's very clear, if you understand physics better than I do, how it is that the motion of molecules creates heat, it's not at all clear how electromagnetic radiation of 700 nanometers of wavelength creates the experience of red as opposed to green or yellow or purple or something else. How come red? Right? That's the explanatory gap that Levine is kind of pointing to. In the face of which, some philosophers have adopted a stance that is generally known as Mysterianism. Okay? This is Colin McGinn, who's the number one Mysterian. And he says, look, ever since Descartes, we've been trying to figure out this mind-body problem and all that, and nobody has ever come up with a satisfactory solution to it. And he says, let's just think about this for a second. It's not that we don't have the neuroscience, okay? It's not that we don't have the psychology. It is that we are simply not smart enough, okay? Nobody is smart enough. Nobody is ever going to be smart enough to close the explanatory gap and explain how it is that bodies give rise to minds. We know that that's the case, okay? That's what I mean by kind of default to materialism here. We know that brains are the de facto causal basis for consciousness, but we are cut off by our very cognitive constitution from achieving a conception of the psychophysical link. So again, psychophysical parallelism, going back to Leibniz, that's the default position. But McGinn says this is always going to be a mystery to us because our minds simply are not capable of understanding it. Okay, and we're just going to have to live with that. That is the basic idea behind Mysterianism. There is another stance you can take, and that's the stance that comes to us from Berkeley's own John Searle, which again starts out with a position kind of sort of like psychophysical parallelism. Searle is very clear that consciousness is a product of brain processes, okay? No question about that in Searle's mind at all. He says, look, at certain levels of anatomical organization, you get consciousness. We know it happens in human brains. We think it happens in other kinds of brains as well. No reason to think it doesn't happen in chimpanzee brains. No reason to think it doesn't happen in dogs and cats' brains. And also, this occurs in under certain physiological conditions. You don't have consciousness during general anesthesia. You don't have consciousness if you're in a coma or maybe in sleep. But otherwise, if you've got a normal anatomy, human-like brain anatomy, and normal physiological processes, you're going to have consciousness. And that's just the way things are. Now, exactly how it works, what Searle does, I think quite correctly, is say, this is not a problem for us, okay? It's a problem for the neurobiologists. So let's just kind of kick it over to them and let them worry about it. We don't have to worry about this. All we have to do is assume that consciousness is a causal property of the brain, and then we can get on with it, okay? Well, that is a stance that I frankly find quite appealing, but it's one that many philosophers have become have been quite unhappy about. There's still a group of philosophers out there who are determined to explain, not only to explain consciousness in terms of the operation of brain states, but essentially to reduce consciousness or reduce the laws of consciousness to the laws of physical substances. And chief among these are Pat and Paul Churchland, a husband and wife team of philosophers, who have argued for a position that they call intertheoretic reduction, okay? Basically taking principles in one theory, a psychological theory of mind, and reducing those to the principles of some other theory, like a physiological theory of mind. And here's how their argument went, most famously in 1998. When the propositions and principles of a new theory mirror the propositions and principles of an old theory, so suppose you have propositions and principles of neuroscience that somehow mirror the propositions and principles of psychology, that's the first condition, and the new theory gives better explanations and predictions than the old one, then the new theory contains the correct description of reality and is to be preferred on that ground, okay? So what the Churchlands are looking forward to is a day in which all talk about consciousness is rendered to folk psychology, something that your grandmother might talk about, but not something that a smart, scientifically oriented person would not talk about, assuming your grandmother is not a scientifically oriented person. You want to get rid of the one theory, really, and focus on the other theory. Sometimes the Churchlands deny that this is what they mean, but that denial doesn't really hold water, because what they're really talking about here is a following kind of argument, an argument that they, in fact, use in this paper. Folk psychology talks about mental states, about people believing and thinking and feeling and wanting and all of that, the language your grandmother would use. Real science talks about physical states, okay? Therefore, if you want to have a psychology, the psychology must be grounded in the real-world findings of neuroscience.